Terrific. Well, let's get started. Welcome to the second episode of the Climate City Insider live stream, a quarterly presentation of the Collider nonprofit network based here in Asheville, North Carolina. Asheville claims the title of Climate City for two reasons. One is the largest repository of climate data on the planet is located right down the street in the Veach Bailey Federal Building, just a stone's throw from the Collider office in the heart of downtown. Add to this the large percentage of professionals working in the climate field, and you have a good argument for the moniker. My name is Mary Spivey, former community manager of the Collider and local science and climate change educator. I'm honored to moderate the Climate City live stream, and I'm pleased to see so many of you taking an hour of your day to join us. I've put the URL for the Collider website into chat so you can visit our website, learn more about what we do, and how you can become involved. Also in the chat is the link to the catalog of all the live streams so that you do not miss a beat. Today's presentation, Beyond a Crisis, the People, Planet, and Places of Earth's Next Chapter, is presented by Ann Waple, PhD, founder and CEO of Earth's Next Chapter and Studio 30K. Crisis, disaster, doomsday, existential, extreme, apocalypse. These are the words we hear more or less every day related to climate change. The media loves the word crisis, and it seems to be applied to just about every challenge we face. But Anne will argue that crisis isn't the right word for our climate challenge, and it isn't going to get us where we need to be as a society. And perhaps more immediately, it doesn't help us as climate or sustainability professionals do our best work. During this fun live stream, that was Anne's quotation mark, fun, Anne will talk through a different framing for how we can think about climate change, have a sustainable and in fact impactful career surrounding solutions, supporting solutions, and accelerate societal progress towards implementing those solutions. Now, a bit about Anne. Dr. Ann Waple is a climate scientist who, for the past 25 years, has worked for federal agencies, nonprofits, and now runs her own consulting practice. Her most recent federal position was technical director of the U.S. National Climate Assessment. Her work in nonprofits includes designing a climate resilience planning framework adopted by over 100 institutions. And for the last 6 or so years, she has run her own consulting practice working with government, businesses, cities, states, nonprofits, and foundations. She has given hundreds of presentations and talks and shares this thought. What I've learned is this: fear about the future, and even worse, shame about who is to blame for it, doesn't work. So Anne created Earth's Next Chapter to inspire us towards creating more of what we do want while solving our challenges as we travel the path. And the URL to Earth's Next Chapter will be in the chat in just a moment. So we are extremely pleased to welcome Anne today. And before we begin though, just a few housekeeping bits. We are airing today via Zoom and YouTube live stream. So only those of you on Zoom are able to submit questions, comments, and network with each other via the chat feature. We will address questions at the end of Anne's presentation. So as questions arise during her talk, just put them in chat and we'll get to them. And with that, please welcome Dr. Ann Waple.
Thanks so much, Mary, and hi, everybody. It's so great to see so many people. And I'm looking at the gallery view right now, and it's almost kind of overwhelming how many names are there. So many of which I recognize, but a good number of people I don't. And that's great. I'm really excited to be able to meet some new people as part of this process as well. And thank you so much to the Collider for putting on this live stream. I think it's such an important way that we can network and learn a little bit about what each other's up to. And so I'm super excited to be part of it, and I appreciate very much being invited. So thank you for that. All right, so I'm going to share some slides, and don't worry, this will be fun, I promise. And we're going to get right into some thoughts about the climate crisis and how we as climate professionals, I think a lot of people on this call are in the climate or sustainability world, And some of you maybe not, but this will cover, I think, most people in that realm of interested in climate. Okay, can you hear me? All right, good. All right, so beyond the crisis, people, planet, and places of Earth's next chapter. So I want to start by acknowledging what is a crisis. And certainly right now we are living through a genuine, legit period of crisis, right? We've got this coronavirus happening all over the globe and has disrupted just about every facet of life. It's immediate, it's urgent. We've had to deploy some really innovative solutions. And you can certainly see how everyone would be thinking about this as a genuine crisis. And associated with this are a whole bunch of other related crises, whether it's a mental health crisis from a social isolation or healthcare workers being overwhelmed. Certainly unemployment and economic crises are related to this. And it's completely appropriate that we talk about this in this kind of urgent, must-solve way. I think on top of this, there are a number of other crises, right, as well. We've got the southern border immigration crisis happening. We've got refugees not being able to find housing. Like, these are short-term, immediate, and necessary things that people have to deal with. And in a lot of cases, they impact a wide variety of people. I think there are some other things that the media tends to talk about in terms of crisis that are not quite so related to an actual crisis. Obviously, the midlife crisis is genuine. I'm particularly concerned about this, and this is obviously very bad news considering I'm 46. So that, you know, there's that genuine crisis. Very bad news. But look at all of these things that I literally just found on the internet in terms of headlines just in the last few days. We've got a talent crisis in the tech world. We've got a data crisis. Before even coronavirus showed up, we apparently had an education crisis, a social crisis globally dating back to 2011 in this case. Apparently all of the 1970s was a crisis in the UK. And there's, which I object to because I was born in the 1970s and I just don't feel like that represents my generation well. But we talk about a lot of our challenges and problems in this attention-getting, media-driven way. And I think that's not necessarily super helpful in terms of how we actually address them and how we can incorporate them into our daily lives. So where does this leave the climate situation that we have right now? In 2021, apparently the crisis got even more crisisy with all of the extremes, of course, that we suffered in 2021. And I'd argue that every one of those situations, whether it's the recent fire in Colorado, hurricane impacts and so on, those absolutely are a crisis for the people who are impacted right then and right there. That is immediate. It needs immediate help. It is overwhelming for the people involved. Everything becomes very urgent and dramatic at that point. So that certainly, all of the events in 2021 certainly qualify. But is it really the case that climate as a whole can be qualified as a crisis? Well, let's just take a look at it. So the first question that I would ask around whether or not we can call it a crisis is, does it require urgent attention? And of course, the answer to that is yes. The more urgent we see the problem, the more likely we are to act now, the less problematic it's going to become in the long term. So yes, it requires urgent attention. Is it dangerous? Well, we've had multiple instances just this year of how climate is fueling extremes that are extremely dangerous for certain parts of the population. And even if you look at back as far as 2012 or so, when the EPA determined that climate was a public health danger. There are all sorts of reasons why we would say, yes, climate change is dangerous. Are people suffering as a result of it? Well, very clearly, climate is fueling suffering in a lot of different places, whether it's stoking a refugee crisis or whether it's a wildfire burning down 1,000 homes just a few weeks ago. So in all of the different aspects of this, do we have to respond differently? Does it require additional people and resources to mobilize in order to address climate change? I think the answer is yes to that as well. So far, climate change absolutely qualifies as a crisis from the way that I'm interpreting it right here. And I'd argue that as we're trying to build awareness of climate change, as we have been for 30 or more years at this point, this can be really helpful. The framing of urgency, of widespread impact can absolutely be helpful to raise the profile and to make us pay a lot more attention to what needs to happen. However, if we were to address climate change today, if we were to cease all carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions today, if we were to change the way we farmed, if we were to do all of the things that would actually reduce the root causes of climate change, would climate change cease to occur? Would the crisis be over? And the answer to that, I think, is no. We will be seeing the effects of human-caused climate change, not just for decades, but in some cases, in some aspects of climate change, for centuries. Sea level rise, for example, is one of those areas where we expect it to go well beyond the 2100 projections that we tend to share with people. We would possibly still be seeing sea level rise changes out to 2200 and beyond. So climate change as a crisis is going to be very difficult to sustain, if nothing else, for decades or centuries. So this is not good news. And I did say this webinar would be fun. So we're going to move on from this, but this is an important beginning to how we might actually talk about this in a more useful way. Here's what the challenges are when we think about this sort of long-term crisis that we're in with climate change. When it's all about the problems all the time, people get scared, right? And when you're making people afraid of the future, at best, it makes people feel powerless. But I think at worst, we're actually achieving the opposite of what we intend. And that is people tend to participate less in the solutions because it's all just too scary and it's too much and it's just too overwhelming. So once we move beyond the awareness building phase, and I'd argue we've done that now, as many people who are paying attention now as many as we'll probably get. So we're in this action phase and we need to persuade people to take action and to participate in action. And so this kind of crisis language is probably not as helpful. And once we feel scared and we feel overwhelmed by it, a very human nature thing to do is to cast about and to see who's to blame for it. If we can just point fingers at the baby boomers or the politicians or whoever we think is part of the problem, that's a natural tendency for us. And of course, that ends up pushing people even further away from wanting to join in and take action. I think for us in the climate and sustainability world, this is as much of a problem as it is for the public. It's just tiring to be bombarded by this language all the time. Every single day in the news, we see something about the climate crisis. We see the extremes happening, and we see some graphic pictures. It isn't sustainable to talk about climate as a crisis if we really want to engage in a lifestyle of living with and preventing as much climate change as possible as we move into the future. So people just literally switch off, or at worst, are actually very anxious about the future. And we can see that now with young people, teenagers. There's a big spike in the amount of what's called environmental anxiety. They don't know what the future is going to look like for them. But the biggest, I think, challenge is that climate change is really sort of an open-ended problem. We don't really know, even if we were to cease all emissions of climate change right now, or global emissions right now, if we were to plant everywhere with trees, we don't really know what the resolution is. When will climate change cease to become a problem? When will it not be a crisis, if that's the way we're talking about it? And we don't have a good endpoint for that in mind. If you compare that to, say, the coronavirus, we know the endpoint that we would like to have in mind when the crisis is over is when it's no longer killing a large number of people, right? When it's either we're all immune to it or that it sort of fades into the background of normal health and wellness and disease, right? So that's different than with climate change. So my contention with a lot of what we're doing with this next chapter now is that when we are so focused on climate change as a problem, then we tend to be quite narrowly focused then on solving a problem, of emphasizing the problem, which means that we're never quite going to get up to that problem and then beyond it, right? We're not gonna quite get there if all we see climate change as is as a problem. We have become our own enemy in the way that we talk about the planet and climate change. And in some ways, I think this is distracting us from the bigger picture of what it means to live on Earth, what it means to live as a happy, healthy society with a vibrant community on a healthy planet. Right? Those are sort of the bigger picture goals. And we've focused so much on climate change as a challenge that we've kind of lost sight a little bit of the ultimate outcome that we want here. So in the climate change professional world, we are in exactly the same boat. Like we not only are we affected by the same kind of crisis-driven language, we often deal in this language as well. We use it ourselves. And so we're sharing this same kind of language with our clients or with our constituents or customers, etc. And at the same time, we're embedded in the process so much that we see genuinely how slow the progress can be. We see the impacts as they're happening. We might have clients who are impacted by this, or we work with people who are really doing their best to deal with this and having a hard time. So in some ways, we're not immune to this, certainly, and we're maybe even more impacted by this kind of sense of urgency and crisis all the time. So I've been providing some mentoring and coaching to people in the last year or so. And the way that I am seeing this show up for us is there's frustration, certainly. There's some indecision about what to do next. How do I have an impact? Nothing I do seems to be working. I'm working all the time, but we're not really making any progress. So there's this burnout that leads to apathy. And it's not all coronavirus related. It's not just our isolation and our COVID response. This really is part of our professional experience, I think, right now. So we're in the midst of focusing so much on reducing risk and avoiding problematic circumstances that we haven't really focused on what's on the other side of that. What would be a good thing to create, not just what would be a bad thing to avoid. When we look at this in the bigger context as well, we've been hearing a lot on the news about the great resignation that's happening right now as a result of COVID. And I think something like 4 million people quit their jobs last month or something like that, 4 million people the month before. This is kind of extraordinary. And my sense is it's happening for two reasons. One is there are lots of people who have a little bit of money in the bank right now, or who are willing to take a bit of a risk. And they're just saying, take your job and shove it. There's the people who are moving away from a bad situation. But I think it's also true that there are people who are quitting because they can't make the sort of difference they want to make in their current position. They want to have more impact, have a bit more autonomy and independence, and really find that position that works for them. It is also true that that's hard to do. So if you go out on your own, and I've had sort of the same experience over the last 6 years as I've been creating my own business. When someone's telling you what to do, it's a lot easier in some ways to show that you've met those expectations and that you're producing something. If you want to have your own role that's a generative kind of role, you've got to sit your butt in the chair and do the work, and you have to create your own sense of what's important, your own values, and figure out how to measure your own impact and progress, right? And so you have to find inspiration for that. There's a lot of persistence that comes with that. But it also means that you have to be able to show up in an authentic way, in a way that is yourself, that you have to share the knowledge that you've gained. And you actually, what a guy called Seth Godin talks about is you have to ship. In other words, you have to deliver things out into the world that has your name on it, that makes you visible, and that also, of course, makes you vulnerable to criticism or huge success that you're not prepared for. But you actually have to hit send and deliver it out into the world. And that's a scary thing to do. So, what's interesting in the global, or certainly the national situation right now, is that we're seeing a lot of people taking on this path, but not necessarily prepared for it. And I think we are in the same position as sort of climate and sustainability professionals, as wanting to have this impact. And what is it going to take? And I want to emphasize this last sentence here: community and support are absolutely essential requirements for being successful in this role. So we have these two things that are intersecting, right? We have this persistent, never-ending crisis mode that we are battered by every single day, whether we're professionals or members of the public. And we have this demand out there for solutions and an opportunity to deliver impact, especially now where there's a lot more flexibility in how we work and where we work. But there aren't that many structures out there for us to have support or community, or to figure out how to do this collectively. The Collider is one of these places that is already out there. ASAP is another organization for us as a community, the American Society for Adaptation Professionals, ASAP. So there are a few organizations out there trying to fill this gap, but as a community, we haven't quite figured out, I think, how to provide our own inspiration and move forward. And so what we see is not just burnout among professionals and disengagement from the public, as well as from professionals, but we're looking at solutions that end up being incremental, because we're too tired to look into the more innovative solutions or the big picture. What are we trying to create versus what are we trying to solve? You know, it's harder to get to that really accelerated space of ingenuity and innovation. So what do we do about that? How do we create a sense of what's beyond the problem? And I think some of it is simply language. Like, we talk a lot about reducing risk and avoiding problems. But if we only talk about a future that's less bad than today, it simply doesn't inspire anybody. We've got to talk about something that we're trying to create that's good, not just less bad. I think if we can see ourselves in the profession as not just reducing risk, one building at a time, one town at a time, one ecosystem at a time, even though those are hard to start with. But if our job is really to think about how our culture and our system can evolve, then we start to see things connected to each other. And we start to see a world that is a little bit more integrated and full. So we're learning a lot as a group of professionals, and we need to share that knowledge. But really, it's the insight that comes around that knowledge. How is it connected to everything else that we do? How do we approach it? That becomes wisdom. And I think our community is just about at a place now where wisdom is really, it's embedded in what we know and see, and we're not sharing it enough at the moment. So for example, this is a concrete example. At the Conference of Parties meeting in Glasgow a couple months ago, there was a really strong agreement made, or a relatively strong agreement made, on reducing methane. And it's the first time methane really got any attention. It's an important part of the climate change puzzle. And so great, we can reduce methane. But if you think just narrowly about solving the climate problem, most of our methane in the US anyway, comes from agricultural production. So a really easy way to reduce, not easy, the easiest way to reduce methane would be to capture methane on these concentrated animal feed operations, feedlots, basically cattle feedlots. And that would reduce methane. It would significantly contribute to the climate problem. We would make the climate problem better by doing that. But if we could think a little bit more broadly, what we probably would really prefer is that we actually don't have industrial livestock operations in the first place, that we would have a limited methane emission from much better agricultural practices, but that we can address the climate problem without ever doing that. So what is our role? Are we about trying to make the future significantly better than it is now, or are we just focused on the climate change problem as a solution? I love this quote from E.B. White, and he says, I rise in the morning torn between a desire to save the world and a desire to savor it. It makes it hard to plan the day. I love it because I think it embodies a lot of what we're struggling with here. We're out there doing our work, saving the planet, but at the same time, it's a beautiful place. And how do we talk about that and celebrate that? That keeps people attentive and connected to what really matters. So there are three areas that I think as professionals and as citizens that we can really focus on. The first is really paying a lot more attention to what is fun about where we live and what we do and how we live, what makes us light up, because that's as important a part of the story as what do we want to avoid, what do we want to solve, and what do we want to elevate, what do we want more of, what delights us. Another part of the solution, I think, is to recognize what we're curious about and not to hold back on that, to just dive in to what it is that makes us say, well, why is that like that? I think a lot of us got into this career, particularly on the science side. I did not get into climate change because of a climate change problem. I got into it because it shapes the world. And geologically, humans have not been what caused climate change, but it was the factor that shaped the way the planet looks right now. Now humans are the major cause of it, but it's no less important to how it shapes the world. So I was just curious about how it all works. What's the story of the planet? And I think honoring some of that curiosity is important. And then really important for us as a community and for us as in our own neighborhoods and towns is developing this sense of belonging. And I think a lot of us have contorted ourselves over the years to fit in, which, as Brene Brown says, is actually the opposite of belonging. Fitting in means changing yourself to be part of it. Belonging is actually being authentically yourself and finding the people who appreciate that. I think we as certainly as professionals right now, we need that sense of belonging. We need to find our people. So the way that we're framing this next chapter is people first, right? 3 themes: people, places, and planet. But it really starts with people. We are the dominant force of change on the planet. So we have to actually start with what motivates us. What are our values? How do we even think about living on planet Earth, let alone figuring out how we do things differently? Planet, of course, is the environment, and a lot of where we all got inspired to be part of this. Places, the places we live, places we visit, that's what connects the two. A lot of us have our most impact in the place we live. It's the place we connect with. It's where we know the most people. So having these themes and starting with people is a way to make those 3 themes that I just talked about, delight, curiosity, and belonging, a little bit more real. So in practice, I think in our community, it would be great for us to start to figure out what language can we use that is being clear about the risk or how important a problem is or what exposure we're going to face from climate change without using quite as much of the catastrophic language. It might really be important for us to start to change the way we talk to our clients it's going to help us, and it's also going to help them. I'd also say that whenever we're having a conversation where climate comes up, having some balance between understanding the problematic aspects of it, but also thinking about what's already going well. What do we want more of, not just what do we want to avoid, and really helping people see what's good about the community or the national park there next door to, or all kinds of other great aspects of life. And I would also say that we should share our own delight on the things that we love outside the window, or what it means to us to live on planet Earth, as well as listening to what other people just love. And sharing more of that, because the more we can really elevate each other and inspire each other, the more likely we are to get to solutions. That's my goal here, is to accelerate the move towards solutions, not diminish that pace. And I think we're at this drop-off point now where we're just tired of all the crisis. What we need now is a boost of energy, of stories, of fun stuff that we can get into while also doing good work. And my goal as well is that we should take more time off to actually enjoy the planet we're trying to save and to show people, whether it's through pictures or through stories. What we're doing in this next chapter, I'm going to look at 4 themes this year in my writing and my outreach. And these are themes that cut across those people, places, and planet circles. Each one of these touches on all 3. I'm particularly excited about food because food, and it's such a cultural thing. And our well-being, our climate, our resilience in the face of all sorts of challenges, all related to, can all be related to food, as well as equitable access to good food, how we grow it, how we think about it, what is its meaning to us, and how we do better with food. Travel, what does it mean to see other places? And I think we've gotten a little insight when we can't travel anymore for the last couple of years, how much that has taken away from our enjoyment of the world. I've been working with the American Institute for Architects for a little bit this year, and just all of the conversations we've had about design, which have been so inspiring to me, that we're not just designing for a building that could withstand a hurricane, we're of course designing communities. We're designing a place that is a better place to live with a higher return on investment, not just a building that withstand windier conditions, right? So buildings, tech, furniture, all of the products that we use influence our day-to-day experience, and how do we do better with all of that? And then finally, what does it mean for us to have wild spaces still on the planet, and why is that so important? If it is, I'm looking out my window right now at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and how do we manage national parks so that we can all enjoy that? So 3 things that I think that I'm committing to in all of this process as I'm thinking through all of this for my own work. I've had a small experimental group this year called Earth's Next Chapter Pro, and we've been looking at all sorts of things. And what's clear is, and what's resonating with people, is to have this kind of community where we look at making progress, about sustaining each other, building momentum, and also really figuring out how to enjoy our work and do our best work at the same time. And this is not about sharing the latest climate resilience planning framework. This is really about how we work, how we do our work, and how we live. I'm also committing to sharing more of my voice, and those 4 topics I just talked about. We're going to have a podcast. We're going to do some interviews and some articles, and I'm really interested on that. We're going to have a little free membership group for people to stay up to date with all of that, and I'm excited to see where that goes. And then most of my work still is on consulting and courses, and I'm continuing that work because it blends actually working in practice with developing some of these perspectives. So I'm going to advocate that we, even while we're solving the problems, we think of ourselves less about fighting a crisis and more about creating a future that we really want to live in. And Earth's Next Chapter is all about making us excited to turn the page and for what's next, rather than dreading it. So I'd love to hear from people, and love to hear everybody's questions and see what you all think about this. Thanks so much.
Anne, thank you a lot. I'd like to start with asking you a question about something that you said that kind of made me go, because you've shared a lot of stories with me about how you have engaged your neighbors and other people. And you were saying, talk to them about what you would say is going great in the climate realm. Can you give me some examples of what comes to mind? Because I'm kind of drawing a blank.
Yeah, well, so I live in East Tennessee, so conversations about climate are still interesting. When you tell people what you do, it's always going to be an interesting response from people. So among my neighbors, there's a guy, and he was asking me what I did, and my inner monologue is like, and here we go. And I said, I am a climate consultant, and I've been a climate scientist. And he said, oh, that's great. He said, I need to ask you some questions. So this is a guy who worked for the gas company locally for his career. And he said, I've got stock in the gas company. Should I keep it in the gas company, or should I be looking at other things? And so we had a great conversation about where the financial sector is going in its support of different pieces of the clean energy sector. And how many now, so I was just saying, for example, the large financial institutions, BlackRock, Fidelity, and all of the big financial sectors are now, it is pretty mainstream that people now have ESG portfolios, environmental and social governance portfolios. Those portfolios are doing just as well, if not better, in many cases, than the traditional portfolios that have emphasized fossil fuel companies. So we're beginning to, when the financial sector starts paying attention to what is better for the better returns and also good for the globe, then I think we're seeing a real shift. And so that was a fun conversation to have with him, where we talked a lot about renewable energy and so on, which is also has been trending up in deployment and trending down in price. And so these are good stories to share.
Okay, that helps. So from one of our viewers, Fletcher Moffitt, we have a question. How would you mitigate environmental and global warming risks on a personal level as it relates to how and where you live for the next 10, 20, 30, or even 50 years? Fabulous question.
So that's a great question. So in terms of, say, deciding whether you live in a city or deciding whether you live in the South or deciding whether you live in the North, I presume. There are lots of factors that go into whether or not a place can be more or less sustainable. And I actually think the most important thing is to get engaged at the local level to figure out wherever we live, how to make that a more community-based, sustainable focus. So for example, I recently moved to East Tennessee from Asheville, and I just got an email back from a guy in the local college, and we're gonna just say hi, and I'll get to know a little bit more about what's going on locally here in the sustainability scene. I mean, in terms of the climate risks of where you live, coastal areas will certainly be seeing some changes in terms of storm surge and sea level rise. And we're already seeing in the Southeast and Gulf Coast in particular, now almost daily impacts in some cases from high tides, for example. So it's worth looking at, so the National Climate Assessment, for example, is a good resource to go to to look at the regional impacts of climate. They have a chapter on each region and a chapter on different things like public health or agriculture and so on. So I'd suggest that as a resource for climate risk. Does that help? Is that what do you think the answer? Do you think that addresses the question, Mary?
I think so. And Fletcher, if you have a follow-up to that, please throw it in chat, please.
Great.
He says, thanks, helps, and thank you.
Great.
I love it. All right, Anne, another one. You're going to love this one. Could you unfold the idea that people doing well is actually beneficial to professional goals? Because somehow many of us are still stuck in this suffering for the greater good model. So what would you say to that?
I love this question. So this has been, so I am married to a mental health therapist, and she coaches other therapists and other healers in business practices. And one of the key things that she finds is that because we serve people, because her coaching clients serve people in crisis, we think we shouldn't be earning money. And of course, the absolute opposite is true. When we're doing well in our work, when we are being fairly paid for good work, we do better work. And it's a 100% correlation. And in the past, when I have had clients that I've charged very little to, for example, when I've felt like, well, I'm not sure they can afford it, no, it's been the hardest relationships to navigate, and we've had a less good experience working with each other than we would have at a place where we both felt fairly represented. So I think it's imperative that as we go forward, because this is going to be with us forever, the climate, essentially forever, the climate industry is going to be a really key part of solving problems as they arise and emerge and change over the decades and centuries. I think just as the medical profession, for example, we need to establish ourselves as hardcore professionals who are really in it to solve individual and collective challenges, and to do it in this framework of everyone can do well and in fact do better.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Anne. Now let's move on to food. We like food.
Love it.
So you talked a lot about, during your methane slide, you talked about alternatives for, food production in the future, and that's what this one concerns. Gail Thompson volunteers in Michigan at a nature center farm, growing lots of vegetables for a CSA. I think this is a good way to keep food, maybe to grow food. What do you see for food production in the future? So what do you see as far as, the contributions to emissions coming from food? How do you see that changing?
Well, I think it's a huge and complex set of factors, right, that go into how we produce and consume and think about food. And what I'm excited about in terms of a series on this is to actually talk to a whole different slew of people in terms of how they, the experts, are looking at and thinking about food, from chefs to CSA organizations, to small farmers, large farmers, and urban farmers. There's going to be, and really the people who package and deliver our food as well. So I'm actually fascinated to see what will come out of that, and I hesitate to proclaim any sort of insight into what it will be, but I do think that soil is going to be an important piece. Mm-hmm. So how we treat the soil is at least as important as how we grow and harvest the food. And I do think land use, this balance between efficient land use, but healthy treatment of the land. So not so many chemicals probably, even if it increases the yield. I think there'll be lots of discussions about GMO and how we modify the crops themselves. That will be an interesting discussion. I invite you to join us in that. And if you have any ideas for who we should interview, I would love to hear it. I have some people already in mind from the sustainable farming side, but I would love to hear some other ideas, including chefs and people who actually provide us with food every day.
Well, we've had one suggestion already, something about corporate farming. So make sure that is included in your list of topics. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes.
Right. We further up earlier while you were talking, Anne, we did have a lively two-part chat on methane and its percentage of contribution to the total global warming. And one reader, Ellen Miller, suggested it was 14%, that cows are 14% of the total warming potential, according to the FAO, which is pretty substantial. Yeah,
it's a big factor. Livestock in general, I think sheep also provide are a significant part. But yeah, the way we farm livestock and when and how much we farm livestock is a really significant part of methane. It would be dwarfed by the amount of methane that could be released from Arctic tundra if that really starts to melt in a significant way. So, just something to bear in mind about the Arctic and how we manage that. But we absolutely could be addressing farming practices in a way that manages methane and that produces better, healthier food on good land with better treatment of cows, probably as well.
So if we wanted to tie this up, your Earth's Next Chapter the goal is to keep the joy while addressing the big problems.
Find the delight. Yes, it is. Actually, every time I have a one-on-one conversation with people about this, it really feels like it resonates with people, that we're so beaten up by the way we are dealing with our own problems right now, that we're failing to remember why we're doing this in the first place. And so the more we can tap into that, I think this is the time for both professionals and interested parties in general, and really savoring our place in the world and the world itself is going to help us do better in managing our future. That's my contention.
Okay, so interested in Earth's Next Chapter, the link is in the chat. You can also just type in Earth's Next Chapter.com, right? And
yes, .com. Yes.
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 And
.com is where it is. And yeah, if you just search for it, I think it comes up first of all.
Good. So go there, see more about what Anne has going on and how you might want to get involved. We have some chat going on, interesting places to go. So yeah, go on, check on there. There's some people talking about the climate communications link from Yale.
Yep.
They do a lot of good messaging and things like that. So, Anne, thank you. Our next Climate City Insider live stream is Wednesday, April 6th at noon Eastern Standard Time. We have a slight change from our our heretofore established Tuesday at 2 schedule, but we decided that it was good to mix things up to allow for a greater number of people to participate, and also for our speaker, who will be Michael Totten, the founder and CEO of AssetForLife.net. His talk, titled Farming the Sun, Agrivoltaics and Billion-Ton Greenhouse Gas Reduction Opportunities, explores the gainful renewal of our energy systems, global energy systems, regeneration of farmlands, and beneficial revitalizing of our rural economies. So stay tuned for that. Keep an eye on our website. Sign up for that as soon as you can. Thank you to everyone who participated today, to Dr. Ann Waple for her insights and positivity. That was also some stuff, Ann, that's popping up on chat.
Yeah.
Thank you for a dose of positiveness. To our behind the scenes tech team, and to all of you for coming and for your interest in this climate work. Oh, let's see, we do have a few minutes, so, we can sit here and chatter. I just, the questions had kind of stopped, but now we have more people like throwing things in. So if you have to go, you can, or we can, I don't know, Tech Central, do you want to hang on?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's some kind of fun stuff on here. Let's see, this one's kind of fun. Martha Combs just said, if I had unlimited funds, I would build a new parking facility downtown and turn Rankin into a multi-level growing facility and market similar to what I saw in France. Okay, great idea.
Love it.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to have to think creatively, right?
I think so. And it's much harder to think creatively when you're being beaten up by all of the, when you're hopeless, you're not going to be creative, right? So we absolutely need creativity and community solutions and a little bit of willingness to back an out of the box idea to see what happens. We can be experimental in small scales as well as large scales. And I think it's much easier to do that when we sense possibility as opposed to hopelessness. Yeah, Mary was just asking about the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the way that the international reports and possibly the national reports also tend to highlight the doom and gloom messaging. They tend to focus on that. I think there's two aspects of that. The first is that both the international and the national reports have a climate science foundational report that is literally about what we should expect, what the likely impacts are going to be. And that's sort of a lot of where the doom and gloom messaging comes from, because it's like, we're going to have more floods and we're also going to have more droughts and it's going to get warmer and so on. That's the foundation, and that's the reality, unless we turn that trajectory down very rapidly. There are two other reports that come out from the IPCC, though, that get a lot less attention. And this is why I think the media is partly the problem here, is that one is on adaptation and vulnerability. So we're looking at who's vulnerable and where, and what we're doing to moderate that vulnerability, how we're adapting to the change. And then the other report is on emissions reduction and mitigation of the problem. Those tend to get a lot less attention. But one of the things that came out of the mitigation report this time for me was when I was first looking at this, and we were looking at the scenarios, this is maybe 15, 20 years ago, we're looking at the scenarios, we were very much on that very top scenario. The globe was heading towards 100% catastrophic emissions trajectory. We are now more or less on the middle trajectory because of the agreements that have already been made globally by each nation and the work that a lot of nations have done to reduce emissions. I think that's a huge story that needs to be written. Is it where we need to be? No. Is there still going to be lots of impacts? Yes, for sure. And we still need to bend that curve significantly downwards. But the fact that globally we've actually been able to do that already, been able to take a good chunk of our future catastrophe away, I think is a story that people need to see in order to keep working on it, to keep plugging away and supporting our progressive politicians.
That's a great question. I'm trying to think to myself, how can we as people get that message out? And I suppose writing articles or just talking to people about it. Yeah, that's where the hope is.
And that's partly why I'm thinking, as a community, sharing our own authentic perspectives is really important, so that it isn't mostly a media-driven conversation. We have a lot of insight that might be more nuanced, or it might be, digging in to a little more detail than we would just see in the media, but people that want to know about it, I think. And it makes us vulnerable. I mean, just saying here that putting out there that using crisis language with climate might not be helpful, that's a controversial statement, right? And there were a couple of comments that were not so favorable, I think, in the chat. And it's to be expected when we're doing something new that we take a chance on things like that. But I also think that it's worth experimenting, exploring.
So when we're looking into the future, what is long-term thinking? Is it your lifetime? Is it seven generations beyond, to use the Native American idea?
Well, right now, long-term thinking, I don't know what I'm going to have for dinner. So that I mean, a lot of what when we were first putting climate projections out there into the wide world, we put them out for anywhere between 25 years into the future and 100 years into the future. And as a graduate student, I remember thinking 100 years into the future, no one cares about that. Why would we do that? People care maybe about the next 10 to 20 years, but maybe 40 or 50 if you're a building designer, but not 100 years. I actually think now there's a lot more sensitivity to that, and 2100 is nowhere near as far away as it seemed, in the late 90s when I was in graduate school. I think it's worth us looking beyond 2100 for a few things to say, sea level rise is not going to stop here. So yes, we should design for the next 20, 30, 40 years, but not to forget that change will keep happening. So the key with design, I think, is adaptive design rather than adaptation to a specific future. So if we have a process that allows us to keep adapting, that's much more important than picking a time frame or a number in terms of sea level rise or heat or whatever to adapt to, because that will always be wrong in essence. So we can just think adaptively, be flexible, be interested in what's working and what's not, and change accordingly.
Anything else out there? Anyone else have anything on their mind? Well, one last one, Anne. This is kind of interesting. Where do you think the biggest technological breakthrough will come from in terms of benefiting the environment and changing our current environmental trajectory?
I have no idea.
Crystal ball.
None. I mean, we're very focused on energy right now, obviously, technologically. I've been very interested in district energy as a potential solution for how we deploy energy. So we can generate it with all sorts of renewable means, but how we actually get access to it in the local environment is really interesting. And if you looked at, say, a picture of Hurricane Sandy, the lights of Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy were almost all out, except a small chunk in South Central Manhattan, which was NYU. And they had a district energy solution where they could island themselves from the grid and continue to have energy for a while, at least. Yeah. So all kinds of solutions like that cut across resilience and mitigation measures. They're win-win, and they provide community value too. So another win. I'd love to see more innovation around that, and also residential creation of energy. We put solar panels on the roof. Why don't we have building materials that absorb solar, right? In place. So, but there's all kinds of technological innovations that I think are going to surprise us all. I hope so. I hope they'll surprise us all.
Let's stay tuned, because they will play a part in